say good afternoon to everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for our live recording of our Brussels Sprouts podcast. My name is Andrea Kendall-Taylor, and I'm a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program here at CNAS. And for those of you who might not be familiar with Brussels Sprouts, it's a weekly podcast hosted by me and Jim Townsend, who I hope will be up on the screen with me here shortly. And if you haven't listened to Brussels Sprouts in the past, we hope that you'll give us a listen. Today, as part of our annual conference, we're recording this special live edition of the show, which is always really fun because you, the audience, has an opportunity to inject questions for our guests. The focus of today's discussion is the future of the NATO alliance in the run-up to the Madrid summit, which is taking place here at the end of June. And discuss this topic, we're welcoming three distinguished guests. So during the first half of the program, Jim and I get to sit down with U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Julie Smith. And then afterwards, we'll say goodbye to Julie and we'll welcome Steve Erlanger and David Sanger from the New York Times to continue our conversation. But before we begin, we're going to jump into our typical recording. But before we do that, I just want to encourage the audience to ask questions throughout our recording. This really is intended to be a bit of an interactive discussion, and we welcome any questions you have for either Ambassador Smith or Steve and David. And Jim and I are going to be weaving those questions into our discussion as we go. So be sure, if you want to, you can include your name so we can also give you a shout out on the podcast. And to ask a question, you can either use the chat function on the CNAS conference website, or you can tweet it using the hashtag CNAS 2022. So without further ado, let's bring up Ambassador Julie Smith and we'll get started with our podcast. Welcome, Julie. We're going to go through the typical ordeal. So I'll jump right into our intro.
All right. Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. It's great to see you guys.
All right. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor. And Jim, you're on mute. Can we hear you now? Okay, I'll do the intro. No, we can't hear you yet. Okay, 1 second. Love the technical difficulties. Jim, you try to leave and then come back, okay? Okay, but I'll do the intro. So I'm Andrea Townsend, and I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor, and I'm Jim Townsend, and we're so glad you can join us. Over the past several months, the NATO alliance has been working hard to respond to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So far, NATO has maintained a strong and united front, demonstrating its enduring value in an era of heightened instability in Europe. The war has also brought significant change to NATO, demonstrated by the recent watershed decisions by Finland and Sweden to apply for membership in the alliance. As we look forward to the key NATO summit in Madrid at the end of June, we're really pleased to first welcome Ambassador Julie Smith, who will give us a sneak peek into the Madrid summit. And after we say goodbye to the ambassador, we'll welcome Steve Erlanger and David Sanger from the New York Times for a follow-on discussion on NATO and European security in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So first, I'm really happy to welcome Ambassador Smith. Julie, welcome back to Brussels Sprouts.
Thank you. It's good to be back with the Brussels Sprouts gang. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, it has to be said for those of you who don't know, Julie, before she became ambassador, was, in addition to many of her other professional endeavors here at CNAS, and it was Julie and Jim who created Brussels Sprouts. So it's an extra treat to have you back.
I feel like I should have my Brussels Sprouts mug sitting here in Brussels.
I know, likewise. Okay, so lots to get into, and I know we just have you for a short time, but I think the key focus is really the Madrid summit. Obviously, many of us have been looking forward to the summit for some time. It's obviously taken on added significance since February 24th, and yet I feel like there hasn't been a whole lot out there in the public domain on what we can expect for the summit. So I'm hoping, and I want to just start by turning it over to you, to the extent you can give us a little bit of a sneak peek into the summit and what we should expect.
Well, so there's kind of two stories to the Madrid summit. There's the plans that we had in place before February 24th and the plans that we've since created in the wake of Russia's war in Ukraine. So before Russia went into Ukraine, obviously the crown jewel of the Madrid summit was going to be the strategic concept. This is the key strategic document that the alliance relies on to lead it in identifying its core purpose and its core values and its core tasks. This document's written roughly once every 10 years. The last time NATO wrote a strategic concept was in 2010. So the alliance set itself on a course to create a new strategic concept in 2022, and work has been underway to try and negotiate that. It's a lengthy document that will cover a whole range of topics. Obviously, folks will be very eager to see what the alliance is going to say about Russia. I can't say with any certainty, but I think it's safe to say that the language in 2022 is going to look significantly different than the language in 2010. There are going to be some new additions to the strategic concept on top of it. We're going to see most likely a mention of China for the first time in the strategic concept, which will be an important new development in NATO's history. And then you're going to see a heavy emphasis on the future. You're going to see allies putting a strong point on new challenges, things that they've been grappling with only in recent years, months, or in some cases weeks. You'll see mention of things like cybersecurity. There's going to be an emphasis on emerging and disruptive technologies. There'll be a section on climate change, and we can get into some of the other details down the road. But that's point one, the crown jewel of the strategic concept. Now, in the wake of Russia's war in Ukraine, there's some things that we've added to the list for Madrid. So we're going to have to talk about force posture. NATO moved thousands of troops onto its eastern flank in the wake of Russia's invasion. But now the question that's on the table is, what more should NATO do? What kind of medium and longer term outlook should the alliance have? And so we're going to have something to say about that in Madrid. And lastly, I would note, as everyone knows, Sweden and Finland walked through the front door of the NATO alliance a couple of weeks ago and formally announced that they want to become members of this alliance. The hope is that perhaps we'll have the good fortune of having those two countries sit at the table in Madrid as invitees. That may or may not happen. We don't know exactly about the timing. There's a whole process that has to follow after a country walks in the door and submits the formal request for membership. You've heard that Turkey has some concerns. We're dealing with those concerns. We're discussing them at NATO HQ. So I'm confident that Sweden and Finland will join the alliance, I hope, in the weeks and months, not years. I know they will join the alliance at some point, but we'll see whether or not they'll be in Madrid as partners. They're strong partners to the alliance, so they'll be there one way or another, or if they're sitting at the table as invitees.
Wonderful. So Jim, are you in? Can we hear you now?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank God. I was going to call the Geek Squad to come over and rewire it, but that would have taken a long time. Well, hi, Julie. It's great to see you. So a question I have is, what unique U.S. fingerprints are going to be on the strategic concept or at Madrid? You know, the alliance, you talked and gave us some great information on what the alliance is going to do and the alliance approach, but what's uniquely U.S.? You know, force posture, certainly everyone is wondering about deployable versus already deployed forces, you know, rotational forces, and that kind of thing. So what's going to be a unique U.S. fingerprint on the Madrid summit?
Well, there'll probably be a couple different things that you can point to. And again, we're in the middle, as you'll remember, late night negotiations are happening each and every day and into the night here at NATO HQ. So I can't say with any certainty exactly what certain sections are going to look like, but I think I would start with the issue of China, the Indo-Pacific, the China-Russia relationship. This is something that the U.S. has been leading on. It's an issue where the United States, but also we've worked with other allies who feel the same way, that it's time for the alliance to acknowledge that China is now a challenge for the alliance because of its activities in and around the Euro-Atlantic area, the investments investments it's made in its own military, its efforts to modernize its military, but also some of the tools it's using in Europe's neighborhood. We are seeing a greater reliance on things like some of the hybrid tactics, disinformation, economic coercion in some cases, some of the investments that China is making in critical infrastructure, again, in and around European territory or in the Euro-Atlantic space. So for that reason, the United States, working with some other countries, we've pushed to have NATO dig into the subject of China in the Indo-Pacific. And in fact, one thing that I didn't mention is for the first time in NATO's history, we're going to have 4 Asia-Pacific partners present at the summit. So Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan will all send their leaders to the summit. That's never happened before. And I think what that does is it sends a strong signal about NATO partnerships, but also the importance for NATO allies to work with other like-minded democracies around the world to share lessons learned, to work on things like cybersecurity or emerging and disruptive technologies. And so it's going to be a key part of what we do.
Let me do a follow-up, if I could. How about U.S. force posture? I know there's a debate in the Pentagon about what that might look like. Can you give us any hints on what the future for the U.S. forces in Europe might look like?
Can I really quickly, Julie, before you answer, I'm just going to piggyback on it because I think one of the things that folks have been talking about is, I think Russia's re-invasion of Ukraine is a pretty clear violation of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And there's been some increasingly vocal calls that it's time to suspend that, which would kind of free up the United States to have a more permanent presence. So I don't know if that's something that's being discussed around NATO headquarters and whether it is time to take that pretty clear step and send that clear signal to Moscow that, time out, this violates that principle. And so we're going to move forward in some decisive ways to counter this threat.
So there have been a number, to start with your question, Andrea, there have been a number of debates across the alliance about the future of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. All allies are in full agreement that Russia is in violation of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. And all allies are also in agreement that we now are not really in a position where any of us feel compelled to look at what's in the NATO-Russia Founding Act to determine future force posture. So there were previously limits on what allies could do in new member states. And I think we've entered a phase or a moment in history where allies collectively believe that they have the freedom to make decisions about future force posture that's free of some of those commitments because of what Russia has done in Ukraine and how it is violating the NATO-Russia Founding Act. So I don't know exactly what language the allies are going to settle on in talking about the NATO-Russia Founding Act, but I can tell you that there is consensus building inside NATO about the limits or the lack of limits that the NATO-Russia Founding Act puts on us as we take those posture decisions. Now, on Jim's question about where we're going to land, I mean, as you know, allies have moved tens of thousands of troops into the eastern flank. Before Russia went into Ukraine, NATO had 4 multinational battle groups in the 3 Baltic states and Poland. In recent months, we've doubled that. We now have 8 multinational battalions in Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. There is now an additional debate in the alliance about, first and foremost, what's happening to the troops that have already been sent to Eastern Europe? How long are they sticking around? What type of medium and longer term commitments can allies make regarding those forces that have already been deployed? And then there's the question of what is required on top of those commitments. I really can't get into the details of what the U.S. is debating right now, what's going to be put on the table. There's a defense ministerial happening tomorrow Secretary Austin just arrived in Brussels. I saw him earlier this evening here at NATO HQ. Part of what's going to happen at the Defense Ministerial this week is we're going to dig into those questions. As you know better than anybody, Jim, there are open-ended questions about rotational presence versus permanent presence. All of that will be part of the debate. We'll be looking at the threats, we'll be looking at the geography, and all of this will lead us to some sort of decision in Madrid. So sorry, I can't say much more than that, but that's kind of the state of the debate right now inside the alliance.
You also hit on the Finland and Sweden piece, and you kind of expressed optimism that it's just a matter of time before they would be welcomed into the alliance. Can you talk at all about kind of how serious Erdogan's obstruction is? And do you think it's going to have to come to, an engagement from President Biden to shake this loose? Or I don't know if you can say anything more about what the timeline might be or what the process is to try to secure their continued progress into the alliance.
Well, first of all, I would say that allies are in agreement that this is wonderful news. Allies have welcomed the decision by Sweden and Finland with open arms. And even Turkey, as it has expressed some concerns about both of those countries, has simultaneously repeated its policy and views towards NATO's open door policy. It supports NATO's open door policy. This is not about NATO's open door policy or enlargement. Turkey has raised concerns, but the good news here is the alliance has 73 years of history of dealing with allied disagreements. We're used to hands going up in the back of the room and allies saying, hold up, we want to have a discussion, we disagree, we need to debate this. We are having plenty of discussions with our Turkish colleagues almost on a daily basis about this. We're talking about it not only here at NATO, but all of us are encouraging the three countries to get together. And as you've seen, they have met. Sweden, Finland, and Turkey have met separately in a trilateral format. We've seen individual leaders call up. We've seen U.S. principals in the Biden administration engage. You've heard readouts from engagements from Secretary Blinken or from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. So there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. We have multiple allies coming together to work this bilaterally or in multilateral settings. Again, I feel confident that we're going to be able to resolve this. I think it's within reach. And I hope that we're going to see some sort of resolution in the not so distant future.
Maybe I'll continue one more question, Jim, and then I'll let you jump in too. Obviously, as I said in the opening, the kind of unity and cohesion among NATO really has been remarkable, right, so far into the conflict. But in the media and in the kind of dialogue and discourse, there seems to be more and more emphasis on potential fissures forming within the alliance. And I would say probably one of the more notable ones is around what an acceptable end state in Ukraine looks like. And there was even this new polling from the European Council on Foreign Relations that feels like it's gotten picked up and gotten a lot of press, suggesting that over a third of Europeans favor ending the conflict as soon as possible, even if that means that Ukraine has to concede some territory. But clearly there's many within the alliance, many Europeans who strongly, even vehemently oppose that idea. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about whether, and if so, how that fissure is kind of manifesting in the NATO context.
Well, again, I guess I would point to NATO's history and our ability to come to the table and offer different perspectives and yet still maintain unity. I mean, I will tell you behind the scenes, behind closed doors, both before Russia went into Ukraine and after Russia went into Ukraine, allies have had different perspectives. We have a collection of 30 different countries around the table that have different histories. They have different relationships with Russia. They have different perspectives on the best path forward. But I think that's why it's been so remarkable to see the level of unity that we've been able to maintain. And today, as you know, earlier today, the United States hosted the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. This is the third third such meeting where the U.S. is playing a key role in coordinating the security assistance that's going into Ukraine. There were over 45 countries represented around that table, and over several hours, I did not get the feeling once that this group of countries, mostly NATO allies, but again, some other partners around the world, are at risk of coming apart, or that the disunity is going to start presenting itself as a major challenge. Do we disagree? Yes, of course we have moments where we disagree. We all ultimately, though, are in agreement that we want to support Ukraine, that President Zelensky has to make the ultimate decision about how this ends and when he's going to be comfortable to come to the table again and under what conditions. And we are all united in our determination to support Ukraine in this moment, not only with security assistance, but humanitarian and economic assistance as well. So yes, there are different perspectives, and we hear those perspectives each and every day, but that's what we do at NATO. And maintaining unity takes work. You have to sit around the table every single day, sometimes for hours at a time, hear those perspectives, understand that we've got to continue to work at it, but then maintain it. And that's what we're doing. And I, frankly, I've been astounded, I've been impressed, and I've been proud to be a part of it and play a small role in bringing the allies together in this pivotal moment in transatlantic security.
I know Jim has a Jim Townsend question to ask you right at the end, and we are going to get you out of here on time, given that it's so late your time. Really quick question on the military aid. So a new announcement today, another $1 billion in assistance from the United States, which is really excellent news. Do you have any concerns about European allies' ability to sustain the military aid to Ukraine? I think one thing that I don't have a good grasp on is where allies' own reserves are and their ability to sustain the influx of weapons to Ukraine. How are the allies talking about that, thinking about the long term, if this is a very long confrontation with Russia, as we all expected that it will be? What kind of plans and preparations are being made so that we can continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons that it needs and that it's asking for?
Well, this is a constantly evolving process that has many different pieces to it. So first and foremost, we have to take the changing list of requirements that come in from Kyiv almost on a daily basis. So we've got the requests flowing in. We sit with the allies, look around the table and try to determine which allies can respond, who's ready to provide what. And it's challenging and difficult because, again, the requirements are in flux. Initially, you heard us talking a lot about, for example, air defense. We transitioned over time to talk more about ammunition, artillery shortages. Then we had a period where we were much more focused on coastal defense for all the obvious reasons. We're looking now at armored vehicles. You've seen countries donating kilos and all sorts of heavy equipment. So it's an evolving process where, again, first and foremost, we have to understand what the requirements are from a Ukrainian perspective. Then you have to sit and pair them with individual nations. Some nations have given absolutely everything they have. And yes, they've talked about slowly over time raising concerns about starting to get to, I guess, what I would describe the back of the cupboard, where they reach in and discover that they've given a tremendous amount of equipment in recent weeks and months, and they're reassessing what more they can give, again, looking at that list from Ukraine. But some are also saying, look, we can give financial assistance now. Maybe another country, and this is where the coordination is so important, maybe another country has something to give, but they need the resources to either purchase that equipment or in some cases backfill donations that are being provided. We've had allies say, we have something, but we don't have the transport available to get it to one of the hubs and then into Ukraine. So then an ally steps up and says, look, we can help you with that particular challenge. So it takes an enormous amount of coordination. Again, we're in contact not just with the Ukrainians, but really talking to each other, understanding how allies can help each other in this moment. But this is an ongoing debate. Obviously, we're all thinking about how to best sustain this. But again, what I saw in the meeting today was the political will, which is most important, to identify the capabilities that they need and then ensure that they're delivered.
Okay, Jim.
Julie, just one of my standard last questions, but for you, I'm very curious your answer, and that is, you and I both have been working NATO for many, many, many years, and now you're there as the ambassador. You've walked through the door. You've had a number of months now under your belt. What has really surprised you? What has been some preconceived notions that are no longer are valid in terms of your mind? So what's surprised you? What was really different than what you expected?
Well, as you know, you and I worked together at the Pentagon on NATO issues, and so I had the opportunity to take a peek at past ministerials and summits and understand behind the scenes sometimes how things get done at NATO HQ. But there's nothing like actually being here and sitting at the table behind the sign that says the United States, which has been a real point of pride for me personally. I've been amazed to see all of us come together in this moment. I've been amazed to see this very dynamic team at US NATO that brings folks from DoD, but also state together in this shared mission. It's been impressive to see how behind the scenes, small collection of allies, will form. It's almost mini alliances inside an alliance will join forces at the right moment to push something across the finish line. So it's been amazing to see firsthand. I guess the biggest surprise is I thought I knew and understood this alliance inside out, but the reality is I've had a lot to learn, and I'm still learning each and every day how things happen behind the scenes. But it's been amazing to watch, and it does feel like this is history in the making because of this moment, a war in Europe with NATO responding in real time, coming to the aid of Ukraine, but also ensuring that its members feel that they have adequate security, that they're reinforced with the right level of allied support. And I'm looking forward to the Madrid summit, where we'll continue, I'm sure, to see some of that resolve and some of that unity.
Thanks.
Well, this was wonderful. Thank you, Julie, Ambassador Smith, for joining us so late at night after an incredibly busy day for you. We really appreciate you taking the time, and it's always just what a fun thing to have you back on Brussels Sprouts. So thank you for doing it.
It's great to see you guys. Thanks for the invitation.
All right,
we'll get you a mug. We'll get you a mug.
Okay.
It's in the mail.
Thanks.
All right, so now we're really excited to continue the conversation with Steve Erlanger and David Sanger. Are you guys there? Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, Andrew.
Welcome to you both.
Jim.
Thanks so much for jumping in here midstream. Really looking forward to continuing the conversation. Lots of different threads there that we could pick up on from our discussion with Ambassador Smith, but maybe just to throw the floor open and say, did you hear anything that was particularly surprising to you? What, if anything, kind of perked your ears the most? And Steve, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, it's even later for me than it was for her. She's done a very good job at saying what she wants to say and not saying much more than what she wants to say. So I didn't hear anything terribly shocking. I've heard a lot of what she said before. She's very proud to have this job. She knows what she's doing. Other allies are very happy that she's there because the seat was empty for a year. And so she's held in very high regard, and it's a big American leadership moment. So I think, together with President DoD, Austin, and General Milley are here today. It's been a very powerful team. And it's clear that on Ukraine, certainly, American administration is leading the way. And this has some Europeans unhappy, some Europeans worried that their efforts at autonomy will fall away, that it's just too comfortable to be back under the American armpit. But Julie does this with a degree of decency that is very attractive to allies, even those who have doubts.
Were either of you surprised by the optimism on the Sweden and Finland bids?
I think that was about right. I think Sweden and Finland will both get in. There'll be some ugly moments along the way, and somebody's going to have to figure out how to buy off the Turks, I suspect, on this. But particularly in the case of Finland, they clearly bring more weight to the alliance than others that have been let in recent years. So I think that's one point. On Steve's point about their appearance, first I had to laugh at what Steve was saying because he's absolutely right about those who were worrying that the United States would be too dominant. Excuse me, 2 years ago, the concern was, were we leaving the region entirely and getting ready to unplug from NATO? Mm-hmm. So, if people have gone over to worrying that the United States is going to drown them out again, I would say that's probably a pretty good problem to have, or as Bill Clinton used to say, a high-class problem to have, right? Second, I think one of the reasons that Ambassador Smith has been pretty successful so far is everyone understands the nature of her relationship with Joe Biden. That's not always been the case with NATO ambassadors. Some have come with a close relationship with the president. Some have come with no relationship with the president. And in this particular case, having a close relationship is important because they know that if she needs to make a phone call to bring down the hammer, she can do it. I think the third thing that's sort of interesting to note about NATO at this moment is heading into the summit in Madrid. Everybody acknowledges we're at a different phase in this war. We're in the ugly, slogging, inch by inch across a narrower, smaller part of territory. And by all indications, this is playing to the Russian strength right now. So it shouldn't be any surprise that there is some beginnings of differences in strategy. You saw it begin with Macron's call not to humiliate Putin, which read quite differently from Secretary Austin's call that we make sure that Russia is never in a position to be able to go do this again. It's going to be interesting to see if Macron gets adherence to his view.
Yeah, I know Jim has a question, but just really quickly to follow up on the alliance unity point, because it is an important one. Julie obviously recognized of course we're going to have differences in opinion when you've got an alliance of 30 countries. And so far those differences have been managed seemingly quite well. But it does to me seem like we are getting into a period where those divergences seem a little deeper or a little more salient or acute. And I don't know, Steve, as you're talking with different people there in Europe, is that your sense? I mean, how would you describe the evolution of unity in Europe? And do you think something's different, or are we, making something out of nothing here?
Well, as you know, NATO isn't really doing the war, right? NATO countries are doing the war. NATO itself isn't doing much except coordinating. Actually, it's EUCOM that's coordinating. And NATO is doing a lot to protect itself, right? To enhance deterrence on the eastern flank, to pre-position equipment, to have 4 more battle groups, right? But for Ukraine, these are country decisions. I mean, military aid is done by countries, not by NATO. The training is done by countries, not by NATO. And there are some countries, particularly the larger, richer countries in Europe, that are really being hit by high energy prices, hit by inflation, hit by these sanctions, which hurt Europeans much more than Americans. because they have much closer ties to Russia. And there's worry that this wars and the sanctions are going to go on and on and on. They've already cut 2 to 3% growth off the German economy. And you think, well, maybe that's okay. But, you know, Central Europe depends on the German economy, right? So this is a big issue. So you get people, I mean, Ivan Krastev calls it the Peace Party and the Justice Party. And the Justice Party wants Putin on his knees and Russia defeated and driven back to Siberia, right? Because they say all our security is at risk from Russia now. And the Peace Party says, we support Ukraine, but it's a very difficult war. We're not going to go war against Russia. NATO's not going to go war against Russia. At some point, you have to have some kind of resolution, some kind of peaceful resolution, maybe not now, but we have to keep ties open to Russia, open to Putin. Russia's not going away. Life goes on, right? And these inevitably create strains. Now, that's not, you know, people are sending weapons to Ukraine. They're sending a lot of money. It's 10% of people's defense budgets going to Ukraine, right? So this is a big deal. It's just some people feel that the Justice Party and sometimes the American aims of weakening Russia for decades to come are just a bit much for the real commitment that the West is actually willing to make to this war.
I think they may also, I agree with what Steve said, I think they may also be sensing that what we're headed to may not be a peace agreement at all, but something more like the Korean armistice. Okay, and let's just play that out for a moment. Let's say that we get to some kind of ceasefire or armistice agreement, and armistice is really just a more dressed up legalistic version of a ceasefire. And at that moment, in return for an armistice, it's hard to imagine a significant lifting of sanctions, because the sanctions would be the last remaining leverage you had in order to get that eventual peace accord. And I think that's what could be spooking many of the Europeans, because they recognize if there is an armistice, not only will the territorial gains the Russians made be baked in for a period of time. I mean, in Korea, it's only gone on, 70 years now, right? And the second thing that we're likely to happen to see is that the sanctions will get baked in too.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is Cyprus. This is lots of problems. This is the West Bank, right? I mean, things, sometimes frozen conflicts, maybe they're safer than unfrozen conflicts sometimes. But the problem for the Ukrainians is they say, this is not the time, because we feel, the Ukrainians, that once more American and European sophisticated long-range artillery comes and sophisticated rocket systems and anti-ship systems come, we can actually do a better job at pushing the Russians back. So we don't want a ceasefire until we have more of an advantage on the ground, because if we start peace talks now, what we're really talking about is territorial concessions, and that's politically impossible for Zelensky.
Yeah, I think Jim, I'll let you ask the next question, but it is going to be really, I think, a critical, this isn't a question, it's a comment. It's going to be, I think, a difficult test for alliance unity. So setting even what that Ukraine is unlikely to agree to any sort of negotiations that concede territory at this point. But what you do hear from Russian analysts is that if Russia is successful at taking all of the Donbass, that then they might then come to the table, offer the ceasefire and say, now we're ready to talk. And then what does that do to cohesion in the alliance with the Italians, the French, and Germans? I think they'll find it increasingly difficult to justify to their publics the costs of war if Russia's offering an end to the fighting. So to me, that feels like a really important juncture in the transatlantic community. But Jim, over to you for a question.
Well, my question has been asked 2 or 3 times over. Let me just throw something out. But I do think that we're in a period now where, for Ukraine, a lot will depend on the delivery of the MLRS type rocket, long range rocket, artillery shells, that capability, the HIMARS systems. And I haven't seen what is in this latest package, but to date we're going to provide 4. The Ukraine is asking for something like 1,000, and lots of tanks and all these kinds of things. We're at a crisis point now in terms of what we provide. If we're gonna, if our plan is to support Ukraine and we're going to, ensure that there is no territory transferred to Russia, to ensure that there isn't a frozen conflict that will favor Russia, then we're going to really have to up our game to include this HIMARS and this type of thing. If we feel that there's not enough HIMARS to go around, which I think is the case, certainly not at the numbers that they're asking for, Ukraine, the Russians are going to really press hard and say, before the HIMARS and these other things arrive, we are going to have to do better on the battlefield so that when we finally reach a point of being around the table, we will have taken everything that we need in terms of territory, and it'll be part of this frozen conflict, and we will have gotten what we wanted. So I think right now, as I look at the fatigue that I'm starting to see among nations, and it's not a division, it's an actual fatigue of not having the Soviet-era shells, not having the inventory in terms of munitions, not having the MLRS or the HIMARS systems. That's the big problem. And I think over the next month, if that type of thing doesn't start flowing in, I just think things are not going to look good at all. So there you go.
Jim, I would just say that today they announced that 3 more were coming, and
so that's a total of 7.
Yeah, and the Germans were going to provide 3 similar systems, and the British have. And they're going to provide more of these big howitzers that are quite good. But, it's a big problem. The Russians have the advantage.
They do.
As I say, what the Ukrainians really are hoping, I think the people I talk to hope the Ukrainians can get through the summer with roughly this kind of territorial situation, because the Russians are still pretty far from taking Donetsk. I mean, even if they take Luhansk, then things settle down, and then it starts again after the winter when Ukraine is better prepared. But here we're speculating, as Laurie Friedman once said to me, war is empirical, right, which means it changes all the time, and it's hard to predict what's going to happen. But you're right. I think these few weeks are really important to the outcome.
Think about the difference in the order of magnitude between the number of HIMARS that the Ukrainians are talking about getting and the number that we can provide them and that we produce each year, which is,
right,
in, I think, the double digits.
Right.
The Ukrainian wish is beyond anybody's, I think, production capability. And that would assume that we were willing to give them, everything that we've got off in storage, which I don't sense is the case right now. I think the other place where we're beginning to see some of these fractures take place is on the question of the gas imports. I mean, I think the U.S. understands that Germany and Italy in particular are highly dependent, but they want to see increasingly a plan for weaning those countries off of Russian gas. And so far, I haven't seen that plan. And certainly not a public one that's out there.
The Germans have made some promises. Part of it is about LNG, and the Americans, just some big factory just blew up, which provides 10% of all American LNG. So it is difficult in terms of supply. I mean, Nord Stream 1 has been going quite happily without anybody talking about it, right?
Although, are you seeing, Steve, the reports that the Russians are cutting the volume that's flowing through Nord Stream? So I think we could also
they are a bit,
from the Kremlin's perspective, if they believe they've passed this Rubicon, that we're never turning back, we're never going back to the good old days before the war. Yes, there's an economic consideration. It hurts Russia too, but they might, it seems to me that the calculus could increasingly be, if we can't go back, then we might as well inflict some pain on Europe while we're at it.
It's true. It's just that at the moment, given high energy prices, even with oil shrinking and coal off the table, I mean, the Europeans are paying, roughly 900 billion euros a month into Russia, right? That's nearly a billion, right? So
Yes.
compared to the
There was
amount
that
of money,
report that came out,
yeah,
they've gotten 93 billion euros in revenue since the beginning of the war. It's almost $1 billion a day. Yeah.
and Europe has provided 2 billion euros of compensation for countries to give weapons to Ukraine. So you see, it is a problem. At the same time, the ECFR did a set of polls that came out today that show that European populations are increasingly sick of the war and sick of the cost of it. So political leaders have to worry about political backlash too. That worries me quite a lot.
Yeah, David, what about in the U.S.? I mean, do you think that Americans are starting to kind of feel I mean, certainly our oil prices or gas prices are extremely high. To what extent do you think there'll be greater pressure on the administration to curtail kind of the support or put pressure on Ukraine to end the war in order to put an end to our high gas prices and inflation and everything else? Kind of how would you gauge kind of U.S. public appetite to sustain this confrontation?
So far, Andrea, I haven't seen much of that connecting of the dots, but it's not going to take much of a leap. I just filled my SUV over in Virginia at lunchtime today, and as I got out of the car to fill it, I heard nothing but complaining all the way across. And they're not calling it Putin's gas hike, so that's going to be an issue for Biden. What we are seeing, and this is the one thing that news organizations can measure, is a waning of reader focus on this, right? So at the beginning of the war, we had millions of, readers coming to the Times website and all that. The numbers are now dramatically reduced. The readers who have stuck with us are reading stories all the way to the end. That must be because of the way Steve's writing his.
It's a very rare event.
Right. It certainly couldn't be anything I'm doing. And so you are seeing that. You've also had a lot of distractions. You've had horrific events. You've had the school shootings. You've had other mass shootings before that. You've had the inflation story, which, grabs everybody. So there is this sense right now that Biden's got a lot on his plate, and that's what's going to make his trip to Saudi Arabia so fraught, because, they have not done a very skillful job so far of explaining why putting human rights at the top of your hierarchy of interest meant not inviting 3 non-democracies to the Latin American summit last week, and at the same time announcing that you're going to visit the Saudis.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the weird things David and I both work on that worries me a lot is the collapse of the Iran nuclear deal, which is basically moribund, but nobody wants to kill it. And, this could come around and bite us in a big way. I really worry about that.
Well, speaking of things that could come around and bite us, I mean, I think one of the things that we're probably all watching too is the way that this war in Ukraine has ripple effects that reverberate far beyond Ukraine. And so thinking of wheat and, food prices, Egypt and some of these other places, how concerned are you that, it's just a matter of time before there's another crisis that the administration is going to have to respond to? Where should we be looking? I don't know, as you're looking at this in the big picture, what are some of the dynamics that are rippling out that you're most concerned about?
Well, I'm with Steve. I think Iran is the one that's coming at us fastest. That doesn't mean the food crisis one is more, and you'll be reading more about this in the Times in coming days. But I think that's the one that President Biden has barely talked about. I'm sorry, Steve, I interrupted you.
No. I was just going to say, for the European perspective, the food crisis is one of the reasons the Peace Party wants some kind of arrangement, right? Because Egypt depends, lots of North Africa depends on, Indonesia. But the third rail in European politics is migration. And what they're really worried about is a whole new food crisis combined with a climate crisis that produces a whole new wave of strains from migration because of Ukraine. Now, we've been lucky, everybody's been lucky, because basically the Ukrainian refugees, and quite a lot of them have come. I mean, to be honest, they are very European looking and sounding, most of them Catholic. They're women and children. They're not single men. They're being welcomed, and most of them want to go home, right? But, Poland is suffering under the weight of this. And there's just a lot of anxiety about a European economy that's never very lively anyway, really going into recession in a big way because of this war.
It's interesting to see also how Turkey plays in this portion about the famine and the movement of grains through the Black Sea. Of course, Turkey controls the straits, and Turkey is the one talking to Lavrov and others about some type of way to move the grains out. Is there something that can be done? And I was wondering, have you all heard anything more about a possible humanitarian corridor? And how do you see Turkey's role in this? You see a very different role in NATO right now. We've talked about that. And then you have Turkey suddenly being in the center of a lot of different discussions with Russia, playing on their Turkish relationship, Erdogan's relationship with Putin. So what are you hearing in terms of Turkish abilities and any kind of humanitarian corridor that might be agreed?
Well, I know the EU is talking to everybody about how to get grain out. I mean, the EU can't do it qua EU. Certainly NATO can't do it as NATO, but a coalition of the willing that included Turkish ships, Egyptian ships, North African ships. The problem is, as you know, the Ukrainians don't want to demine the waters around Odessa unless they have really good security guarantees that Russia won't take advantage of that demining. So that's a much harder issue. And also, I don't know how high the insurance would be on these ships. So they're talking a lot. Biden even talked about getting more grain out by rail and so on.
Yeah,
but
the
hard.
discussion with Belarus is not going well on that topic. And I get the sense from talking to people in the administration that they're all but giving up on the thought that they're going to come up with a way to make that work. One of them said to me the other day, right after the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah, right. Right after Ramadan. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, but I mean, Turkey, obviously Erdogan's in trouble. The economy is a mess. He has elections next year. He's playing on all kinds of nationalist buttons, the Kurdish terrorism buttons. He's got, we'll see what he gets from holding up Sweden and Finland. I mean, he's kind of a stick-up artist who's very good at using the leverage of a consensus-based organization to get attention and to get what he wants. He did it in 2009 when Rasmussen was being blocked, and on the pretext of Danish cartoons about Muhammad.
Right.
And it took Obama giving him a bunch of things that he wanted to sort of get Rasmussen through. Now, I don't know, they keep denying it's about F-16s down the road. They keep denying lots of things. But at the moment, Finland and Sweden are being held hostage, and I don't think this will happen by Madrid. It just won't. But people are still pretty confident, as Ambassador Smith was, that it will happen.
But I do think the big game is in Washington. I think there are things that Erdogan wants out of the U.S., whether it's F-16s, F-35, whatever it is. There's some big goals that they want from the U.S. I think Sweden and Finland. Sure, that's important to Erdogan, but I think really the big game is behind that screen, that Nordic screen there. I think it's really in Washington, and I think they're trying to get some additional things out of us. The things have been held up on the Hill.
We're almost, I think we are at time, but maybe just a quick last question for both of you, just looking forward. Steve, is the EU gonna offer membership to Ukraine? And David, as you talk to the administration, I don't know if anything you can tell us about the mood of the administration on the Ukraine issue and kind of your sense of where they see things going over the next month or so.
Steve, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a lot of political pressure to at least open some sort of path for Ukraine. There's a lot of resistance too, but I think the commission, which is the bureaucracy, on Friday will say, oh, it's great, and dump this hot potato into the lap of the council, which are the member states. And I think there'll be some kind of conditional go-ahead, because it'd be too politically embarrassing not to have it. I mean, we believe Macron, Schultz, and Draghi will be in Kiev tomorrow. And obviously, I think part of the game here is to show their support for at least some kind of European perspective for Ukraine.
But the rumor is that they'll use EU membership as the leverage to try to get him to the negotiating table. Is there any credence to that?
I don't know, because EU membership is decades away. So it's not very useful for leverage. And also, I think they recognize, even Macron said today, it has to end in negotiations, but it's probably not the time for that. And it's up to Zelensky, which is kind of the American line. So he's walked back a little bit.
So, Andrea, to answer your question, the mood in this White House right now is pretty grim, not for reasons that have very much to do with Ukraine. In fact, the handling of Ukraine was probably one of the great bright spots of the administration in its first 18 months, and especially compared to how this same team handled Afghanistan. You know, it looks spectacularly good by comparison. And the mood is bad because of inflation, of polling that suggests they're going to lose control of Congress. The only question is how badly, because you've seen a lot of people leave the White House, surprisingly, a surprising amount of turnover before these midterm elections. And a sense that, important as Ukraine is, that's not going to be the number one issue that Joe Biden's going to have to focus on if he's hoping to get reelected. Now, we don't know if he's hoping to get reelected. He will be pushing 82 come the election. And it's entirely possible, I imagine, that he will not seek to. One thing we do know is that after he loses control of Congress in November, he will be an all foreign policy president, because what little was left on his domestic agenda there, including infrastructure and so forth, isn't going to happen in the absence of Democrats leading the Biden charge there.
If they lose Congress, will it mean anything for the Ukraine policy, or do you think that there's enough kind of bipartisan support for that?
I think there's enough. There is a strain of isolationism that you see in this party right now. So far, it's been relatively limited. But if you got a Trump-like figure back in the presidency in 2024, I could definitely see a lack of enthusiasm for it.
Yep.
Well, we could have continued for at least another 30 minutes, that's for sure. But I really appreciate you both joining us for this special live edition of our podcast. And I just also want to take an opportunity to thank the audience for tuning in. And if you missed any part of our conversation, it'll be available in our normal distribution of the podcast. So Steve and David, thank you so much for doing this, and we'll be in touch again soon.
Yep, thank you so much. Mugs for everyone.
Yeah, mugs.
All right.
And we'll fill in with
Thank
yummy.
you both.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.